Hey, greetings. So I've been out over the past 2 weeks due to work, but I'm back and I wanted to speak to you about Niger. So all over the media, the coup that recently toppled President Mohamed Bezoum of Niger was often described as a surprising event, unexpected by the Western powers, in particular France, which, as you know, has had oversight and control over Niger and over the entire Sahel region forever. It has been said that the surprise was that Niger's president was democratically elected, but none of that is true. Like all other nations under French influence, Niger was never an example of democracy, and its people know it. The 2021 presidential election was not free, was not credible, was not transparent. It was a mere transfer of power between a former president, Mahamadou Issoufou, who could not stand for a third term, to his ally and friend of 30 years, Mohamed Bezoum, the man who was toppled in what clearly appeared to be a continuity of the same regime. Now, condemning the coup is one thing, and it must be condemned. Insisting that we must restore, and I'm going to quote here, the democratically elected president back to his office is a terrible idea. This would be a recipe for more disaster, one that would guarantee to turn Niger into a greater source of trouble for everyone, given that it borders so many countries, most of which are clearly struggling with their own insurgencies and economic crises, etc. Now, during his 2 years as president, Bezoum was never able to ascertain his authority, unlike his predecessor, Issoufou, who imposed himself. And now that a pipeline between Niger and Benin will become operational in the coming weeks, hopefully, Niger may become a bigger exporter of oil than Equatorial Guinea. Enough, anyway, to arouse some envy and trouble, just as it happened in the southern African nation of Mozambique. Now, for the people of Niger, the Bezoum regime is not worth saving. Why? Well, consider this. In 2021, more than 10 million people, or almost 42% of the population, were living in extreme poverty. Do you think the people of Niger really care about the fate of the deposed president, who, by the way, is widely considered as an agent of France? As for Niger's neighbors, there are now two camps. There's the fellow Sahel nations of Mali and Burkina Faso, two countries that also have military juntas that toppled their presidents. They're siding with the new junta in Niger. Against them is this regional grouping called the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, currently led by Nigeria's new president, Bola Tinubu, who just 17 days after being named president of ECOWAS, the Niger coup took place, testing his ability to manage such a big regional crisis. Now, Tinubu and other West African leaders have issued harsh messages and threats to the coup leaders in Niger, including potentially sending troops, leading many commentators in the region to allege that ECOWAS was weaponized and operating under the influence of France. The problem is that President Tinubu is new as the leader of Africa's biggest nation, and so calling for the restoration of a deposed president was probably not the right thing to say at that time. After all, the people of Nigeria themselves, just like those of Senegal and other West African nations, have been vocal about not wanting to wage a war with their neighbors to the north. Indeed, northern Nigerians in particular have many common interests and traits with their neighbors in Niger, including common ethnic backgrounds. But broadly speaking, the people of Nigeria are themselves confronting some very serious security threats and problems domestically, including, as you know, a long and costly war against Boko Haram in the northeast. So, an ECOWAS military intervention in Niger would be yet another disaster for the whole region. And so, as its leader, Bola Tinubu, must seize that opportunity to exercise leadership by perhaps, and this is perhaps, proposing an alternative governance model for the Sahel in a proposition that he will have to convince France that it is in its interest to introduce a democratic process and social and economic reform and development in the region, just the way, think about it, just the way the Americans did in the post-World War II era with their Marshall Plan and massive investments in that they poured in the devastated Europe, that not only led to the stabilization of a battered Europe, but brought prosperity and peace over the long run. So Bola Tinubu should try to bring about a paradigm shift that would take away the sources of instability in the Sahel and replace them with real development. Now, as for the French, well, they are central and key stakeholder in the multiple crises unfolding all over the Sahel and West Africa. France's Africa policy has always been clearly out of step with the realities on the ground. There are hawkish people in France that have always insisted that France must keep its aura and image of a big military power continuing over time in Africa and in the Middle East. Did you notice that countries that are affiliated to France, one way or the other, are in terrible shape, from Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, to Syria and Lebanon? France's hawkish elite, like former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Yves Le Drian, who still is very much active today, is involved as a foreign policy advisor to President Emmanuel Macron, who is also hawkish, by the way. These guys have had zero constructive engagement in Africa. All they wanted and continue to want is to showcase the military might of France and protect whatever economic interests they have, regardless of how troubled are those millions of Africans. A good African engagement, though, is to bring real economic development to the continent and quit installing and supporting dictatorial regimes. Do you know that up to now, there is no single president or prime minister in Francophone Africa that is not first endorsed by France? You couldn't be a president in Francophone Africa if Paris didn't agree. Even in the countries that have terrible war of independence with France, such as Algeria, cannot have a president if Paris did not agree on that person. So what Mohamed Bezoum did was to perpetuate the state of dependency Niger has been vis-a-vis France, just like virtually every other Francophone president has done and is still doing. What is really concerning is that the Western powers again claimed that they had no idea things would go bad in Niger. I think this is completely untrue. France has 1,500 soldiers. The United States has more than 1,000 soldiers on sites in Agadez and the largest drone base in Niamey and in another base in Dirkou in the north of the country. While everyone is puzzled that Niger is now under military rule, the biggest concern is not so much about the jihadists, but about Russia. We all saw Russian flags on display during the most recent pro-coup demonstrations. And make no mistake, they are visible because Russia wants you to know it is behind the coup, participating either directly or through proxies such as neighboring Mali. The Russians have a problem not only with the United States through the war in Ukraine, but with France too, and we will see that those conflicts materialize in Africa. Facing humiliating embarrassment, the French government has sought to pressure the West African group ECOWAS. Any measure to punish Niger is likely to backfire, with a population expected to blame regional leaders about their upheaval. That already happened. It happened in Mali, where punitive measures have had a counterproductive effect, thus giving the military, the new junta, a victim argument calling for national unity instead. The new Nigerian president, Bola Tinubu, is part of the hardline camp. Abuja, which provides, by the way, 70% of electricity in Niger, has already, as you know, disconnected the high voltage line in a country where only 21% of the population has access to electricity. Now, the entire Sahel is in turmoil. You also look east of the Sahel, and you have a devastating conflict in Sudan that started in mid-May in general indifference, while neighboring Chad is experiencing the consequences of that futile war with a huge influx of refugees. How can ECOWAS and its allies dare starting another war in Niger, a country that is facing two fronts, Boko Haram in the southeast and the Islamic State in the Three Borders area? This is completely irrational and obviously a dangerous development. If that happens, the Niger conflict will become international. Algeria and Russia are on the same page on this. The two states have denounced the coup, but they are viscerally opposed to military intervention. If the military intervention really saw the light of day, regional leaders will be facing an African public opinion who will not accept a new war seen as manipulated by foreign forces, even if driven by ECOWAS. As a reminder, the crises in Côte d'Ivoire and Libya that began back in 2011 marked the beginning of a massive rejection of French policy in Africa. A new war would undoubtedly eject Paris from the continent for decades. And who would the local population welcome in open arms? Russia, no less.